Hello, everybody. We are going to get ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining today. The name of the session is Decentering Dominant Culture. And I will share a little bit about what we're going to talk about in a moment. I think it's always important whenever I'm presenting to share just a little bit about myself so that you all know who you'll be engaging with for the next hour. So this picture right here on my right, might be on your left, was me when I was about 4 or 5 years old. My family had just moved from South Carolina to Iowa, and I was going from a very different context, being surrounded by family. I lived in South Carolina mostly around other Black people, to moving to Iowa, where the context was totally different. I went to be being the only Black person in my daycare. And so my parents were very intentional about making sure that I still had a very strong self-confidence and love of who I was. So we talked a lot about different cultures and communities in Africa. And my favorite colors at the time were red, black, and green. So whenever I was coloring, those were the colors that I chose. In the middle, that is a picture of my parents. As you can see, my father is a very light-skinned Black man, which also informed the way that I grew up, also being a light-skinned Black woman. And that's a picture of my mother. And then this picture over here is my baby sister, my brother, and my daughter. All right, so I would love it if someone could come off mute and just read this quote for us as we start.
The world in which you were born is just one model of reality. Other cultures are not failed attempts at being you. They are unique manifestations of the human spirit. Wade Davis.
Thank you so much. So in our session today, we are going to define dominant culture. We're also going to consider the ways in which dominant culture shows up in our work. And then we will explore ways to decenter dominant culture and create more inclusive and equitable outcomes in our various organizations. All right, so to get started, I want to start just by framing what culture is. This is a very simple definition of culture, where it is everything we do, have, and think, and the meaning that we place on those things. So when we think about what we do, think about the decisions, your behaviors, how things impact you. When we think about everything we have, think about rules, systems, structures, spaces, resources, and the ways that we think. Think about core values, your mission, your handbooks, textbooks, etc. Also think about the ways that we place value on different terms like healthy teams or qualified candidates. All of those things are impacted by our culture. And we're going to break this down a little bit further to really get into how culture shows up. So first, if we think about the practices, those are the most visible representations of culture. So if we're looking at the picture, think about the leaves on the tree, right? The most visible pieces of what we're seeing. And those show up as behaviors. So how different people behave individually, how different teams behave, are examples of the most visible pieces of culture. When we go a little deeper, and so if we think about the branches where we can't really see them, but we know that they're there, those are what we say we stand for or what we say we represent, and the languages that we use to influence the way we may think, feel, or make meaning. And then the last piece of culture talks about our underlying worldview. So now we're thinking about the roots, the part that you can't see. But the way that we orient ourselves at the heart, some of the basic things that really make up who we are or how we make sense of the world and how we imagine ourselves in it. These aspects of culture are often a lot harder to see because they've just been so deeply ingrained in us. So we often take them for granted. I want to give you all just a couple examples. I like to use school as an example because we've all been to school in some shape or fashion. And so when we think about a typical or normative day at school, what are some of the things that come to mind? And you all can pop them in the chat or you can come off mute.
For me, what comes to mind, when I was little, I went to a Catholic school, so uniforms,
Hmm.
which were supposed to create uniformity, although there are lots of little ways that we expressed ourselves.
Yep, yep, that's a great example. Other folks, what are some of the things that come to mind when you think about a normal cultural day at school? And again, feel free to pop them in the chat or you can come off of mute and share.
I'll share. There was a pretty structured routine. You know, when you come into the classroom, think about elementary school, take off your book bag, put it in your cubby, sit in your seat, get your assignments out. You know, everybody gets prepared and ready to engage and learn. Typically, the teacher was up front, kind of managing kind of where we were going to go from there.
Yep, yep. Thanks, John. Those are both great examples. And when we think about a typical or normative cultural day at work, some things that come to mind if you walk into an office, right? Usually, more senior staff members have their own offices, and more junior staff members either share spaces or there may be an open concept at the office. So, that's an example of a practice, something that you can easily see when you walk into an office. When we think about the more deep, the branches on the tree, right? I often think about the way that we talk about support staff, right? So do we call people my assistant? Do we say they are supporting blank's work? Do we say that they are, supporting a certain project? Or do we talk about them managing the operations and logistics of the team? Do we give that person ownership, or is their ownership tied to a specific person or a project? And then if I'm using that same example and thinking about the underlying worldview, I think a lot about hierarchy, right? And how am I perceiving this person's work and their value based on their positionality? So that's just one quick example of how it shows up at work. I also want to make sure that we clarify that race and culture are not synonymous. Culture is informed, it's socially constructed. There are lots of different manifestations of culture, but race and culture are not synonymous. So, for example, when I taught in the Mississippi Delta. 100% of my students were Black. I grew up for most of my life in the Northeast in New Jersey. We had very different cultures, right? And so just because I was another Black woman does not mean that I automatically fit into the culture at my school or that I could automatically relate to the culture that my students had, because we grew up in very different geographic locations and had very different cultural norms. So I want to make sure that culture and race are not synonymous. So we can't leave this session saying, well, Latinx people do X or Black people need X at work, right? Because there are a lot of nuances to culture. Also, culture is not static, it's always changing. So if I'm thinking about being at school again, there were different cultures on different teams. I was in the English department. We had a very different culture than the math department, which had a different culture than the science department. And so culture manifests its way often very differently given different teams, because teams are made up of individuals who all have their own personal cultures that they then bring to a space. And so it's always changing and shifting. Um, and then I also want to make sure that we know that culture is happening on every level. So again, it's individual, it's interpersonal, and it's also systems wide. Another example that really comes to mind, given some of the events that happened this summer, there were a lot of organizations that were in this espoused values place where they were changing their language or they were putting out statements in support of Black and Brown people. And there was a lot of conversation when those things were happening from Black and Brown employees at those organizations saying, you're putting out a statement that doesn't match my day-to-day experience. And so let's figure that out. And oftentimes that happens because, again, we'll look at the practices. So we'll look at the things that are most visible, and then we'll try to change our language. But if we don't get to the root and really understanding and unpacking where some of those worldviews are coming from, the tree is still going to grow, right? The roots are going to grow even if we cut down the trunk and cut off the leaves and cut off the branches. And so we really need to make sure that we're thinking about culture from all different lenses and layers. Are there any questions before I move on? Okay, wonderful. All right, can I have another person come off mute and read what's on this slide, please?
A dominant culture is one which has the power to define what is right, what is admirable, who is admirable, what is knowledgeable, what is ignorance, what experience is important, whose experience is important. A subjugated culture is one which has been identified as less than.
Thank you so much. So again, aspects of culture are dominant when they become formally or informally established by institutions, or when they become the normal thing to do. So when we think about culture, there aren't aspects that are inherently negative in most cultures, but they become negative when we place a certain value on them or make it so that is the only way that you can succeed at an organization. So specifically, if aspects of dominant culture become or create inequitable outcomes, that is when they become harmful. And if they stay centered so that that is the only way that you can advance at an organization, or the only way you can get promoted, the only way that you can get praise or value at an organization is through one lens, that's another example of when they become harmful. They're also often harmful when you think about creativity, because all ideas and solutions and innovations are looked at through this lens. So if you're at an organization that is really heavy or strict on the way that you present something, right? If I have this great idea, I'm not going to share it until I've sort of fitted into this box, which could lose some of the innovation that I was thinking about. And so we really want to work to ensure that there are multiple ways for people to flourish at an organization. That's how we start to decenter dominant culture. I also want to make sure that we are clear that anyone can navigate in dominant culture. And so it is not something that only white people do, right? Or only Black people do. Anyone can benefit from dominant culture. And if you are comfortable in dominant culture, you are likely going to get promoted and celebrated because of those things. I often think back to when I was in the dominant culture lens, right? That used to be my only frame of reference, because going through school from kindergarten to 12th, in order to be successful, I had to learn how to perform dominant culture. In college, same thing. I had to learn how to perform dominant culture. And so I remember early interviews that I had, I would always talk about perfectionism as being one of my areas of growth, which is one of the tenets of dominant culture. And so that's something that I just kind of laugh at myself about now, because I was definitely 100% prescribed to dominant culture, because that's how I found success and was able to navigate in different spaces. I also want to make sure that we understand that any culture can be dominant culture. Again, it just depends on the area that you're in, who's in charge, and what are those cultural values that people share. So for example, when I was in Mississippi, I worked with a nonprofit organization that helped adults get their GEDs and help them with job placement. And that organization had a dominant culture. It wasn't white dominant culture. The organization was led by primarily Black women. And I remember one of my first meetings, there was a list of probably about 30 things that needed to be done. And so again, this is when I'm very much in my dominant culture frame. So I'm like, okay, well, who's going to do this? Who's going to do that? Like, let's make a checklist. And everybody's looking at me like, who is this girl? This is not how we do stuff. Everybody participates in everything. We don't separate. This isn't your task. We're all going to help each other until everything is completed. And so I had to learn a new culture in that organization, because the dominant culture there was not the dominant culture that I was accustomed to. Same thing when it was time to clean up, right? It wasn't like only these people stay and clean up. and everybody else goes home, everything was always all hands on deck. And so I do want to make sure that we know any culture can be dominant in different situations. I see a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, I'll get back to those in a minute. All right, so we are going to do our first breakout activity. So a part of the session, there was an article on white dominant culture. If you didn't get a chance to read it, just take it out now or have it accessible. You all have a couple of minutes to read it here, and then we're going to go into breakout groups. Is there anybody that needs the link to the article, or does everyone have it? You need the link? Okay, I'll put the link in the chat. And I will give you all about 5 minutes just to skim that article. 1 second. Okay, the article is in the chat for anyone who needs it. And at 11:21, we'll come back together to discuss our next activity, but just take some time now to skim through that. take about another minute. All right, and let's come back together. So I'm going to give you all a couple of instructions before we go into our first breakout room. So you are going to get to choose breakout room 1, 2, or 3. Breakout room 1 is if you are at home. When you read this, you were like, yep, that's me. That's going to be breakout room 1. Breakout room 2 is if you can perform relatively comfortable. So you know how to navigate some of the rules in the article, but it requires an active decision for you to do so. And then breakout room 3 is you are not close or proximate to it. So you know the rules, but you choose not to follow them and sort of make your own way. In order for us to make sure that we get you in the right group, I'm going to ask that you change your name to number 1, 2, or 3. So the way you do that, if you look at the 3 dots in the top right corner of your box, you can click that, and then you can click rename, and then just put number 1, 2, or 3. All right, I see folks changing their names. Again, just go to the top right corner where you see your name, click those 3 dots, and then you are going to just put a 1, 2, or a 3 there, and we will get you into the correct breakout room shortly. Okay, I just got a message. We're not going to be able to put you in the. It's okay. It's okay, Peter. We won't be able to put you in the corresponding group, so you'll be in sort of a mixed group, but I'll still send the same questions for you all to discuss, and you can just share with your group if you felt like you're more of a 1, 2, or 3. All right. It looks like we're having a little trouble with the breakout room. So we are going to just have a full group discussion. So feel free to use the chat or come off mute. So our first question, as you read this article, for folks who put that they are number 1 or feel at home with the aspects of dominant culture, what are some of the things that felt natural to you? Or what are some of the ways where you felt like, yep, this is me?
I'll go. Um, so I like the fact that it talked about separate people from their mistakes. Um, I could believe everybody makes mistakes, but that's not who the person is. Um, I appreciate um, what people do and how they do it. I, just accept people where they are,
Mhm.
and if they need to, um, sorry, I need to probably get off my cameras on professional. Um, if I need to, um, need to show, show them the way if it's an organization they're coming in new. I believe in giving people space and grace. Um, so giving them this, vet people in and give them the space to grow and develop. And if they need, and if they need that grace when they do make mistakes, basically.
Okay, thank you for sharing. It looks like a lot of folks were in the number 2 bucket. So you know how to navigate the rules, but you have to make an active decision to do so. What were some of the things that came up for you all if you were a number 2 when you were reading through this?
For me, takes me right back to the beginning of my career, which was a big chunk, 15 years in commercial banking. I was one of very few women that were not, administrative assistants, and absolutely having to. I learned how to fit in, but I think as I have come along of quite a few decades since then, I realize, my go-to, which is very structured and goal oriented, and all that, is actually not where I feel best. So that I know how to adapt, but it always feels a little bit like having my shirt on inside out.
Mhm. Thanks, Vanessa, for sharing that. Other folks who were in the 2 bucket, where did you see white dominant culture reflected in your work? And what were some of the things that came up to you as you read this?
I would say, the one that struck me was the quantity over quality. And I think in our field, we want, of course, to do really, really great quality work for our clients. In the nonprofit, we're in the human services space, and it's not about like processing people. It's about being intentional and really focusing on quality. And yet we have this dynamic where we're accountable to other the funders and other other contracts and things like that that are about quantity, right? And so it's this constant like battle of really we want to focus on being really great quality work with the people we serve. That's our mission. But our funders and other you know stakeholders really do care about quality or quantity, and quality, but mostly quantity.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep. That's a great one to call out. Often in the nonprofit space, funders want to see more, bigger impact, more people
Mhm.
served, et cetera. And so that's
Mhm.
definitely a tension that I think comes up a lot for folks.
Mhm.
Anybody else from the 2 group want to share?
I can add the defensiveness was something that I've seen a lot of my career when you make suggestions for new ways, not that the old way was bad, but
Mhm.
that there are new ways to possibly even engage with new communities, new populations, things of that sort. Learned pretty quickly that folks took offense to that, or like it said in the article, threat of someone else's authority. And so, but I learned, I guess, in actively still trying to push for those changes to try to preface my suggestion with a compliment. I guess in some ways it may have been playing to the ego, but at the end of the day, too, there are good things that the organization was doing. And then another thing I also did was actively participate in different committees and task forces that were created to really demonstrate I'm here to be a support to the organization. I'm not just here to criticize or make suggestions and things of that nature. And so that's one way I found that's helped me navigate through some of the dominant culture.
Yeah, that's a great example of how we have to learn how to play the game or how to be successful because of some of the ways that dominant culture can just take over organizations. I think I cut somebody off, so if someone else was going to share, please feel free.
Sure. One thing I noticed was a lot of what I read was what we would consider maybe best management, like practices, streamline things and, top-down leadership. But if you've managed a diverse team and teams that are full of, individuals reflected in the community, it doesn't work well for them. And it's crippling to the team and they can't, flourish. So one point that really stood out to me was, paternalism, but kind of even just the communication. Engaging your team in how they want to be communicated to and what systems work for them and not just what works for me and this is how it is. So that was really something that came to my attention is, leadership often looks like this, unfortunately. And is that going to help your team really? And what can you do to be more inclusive and involve them in that process? So that really stood out to me.
Thank you for sharing. Were there any folks in group bucket 3? I think I saw a couple people in bucket 3. And if you were, would love to hear from you. What were some of the things that stood out to you as you read this culture as things that you actively reject or choose not to follow because it feels very just different from what's normal and natural to you?
So I will share. What stood out for me the most. I think the first thing that jumped out was the fear of open conflict. And I grew up with a very strong sense of self-worth that that was instilled in us from my grandmother. And so I feel that in my career, I have encountered a lot of what we're reading about, but I've always been the one that wasn't afraid of the open conflict. So I've always called things out. Early on in my career, I left quite a few good jobs because I refused to go along with it. And that's kind of where I've always been, the one who will welcome the open conflict against a lot of these things. It feels very uncomfortable to me to just go along with it. And I'm not, the one who can just be silent and just let it be okay. And so, yeah, that one stands out as one of the ones that like jumps off the page for me. I don't think that I ever knew that these were like consider white dominant culture. I just know that they never felt right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think, again, one of the things that we are going to do in a second is think about ways that we can decenter dominant culture so that there can be more of a multicultural environment where people can still succeed and feel comfortable without having to perform in a way that comes at personal hardship or strife for them within the work context. Before I do that, does anybody else want to share from any group things that came up for you as you read it? What elements of white dominant culture do you see reflected in yourself? How do you see it play out at work? Anyone else who wants to share, please feel free to jump in. All right, I'm gonna move us forward. It's always a little harder to tell when to move forward on Zoom. So, all right. So the next thing that we are going to do is really think about dominant culture and how to decenter it. So we're thinking about moving from being a monocultural organization to being more of a multicultural organization Whenever you do that, things are going to come up, right? Lots of feelings are going to come up. We're talking about getting at the roots of the tree instead of just taking off the leaves. So there are going to be questions, there might be fears, there might be hesitations that come up for people. Just notice that, because I don't want you all to try to engage in this work and then, be surprised when not everyone is immediately on board. Those things happen and they are expected. I also want us to be really clear that we are not talking about pendulum swinging. So we're not talking about throwing away everything from dominant culture and creating an entirely new culture. What we're talking about is trying to move the ball more to the center so that there are multiple ways of achieving success, multiple ways of being creative that aren't only fed through one lens, which is the lens of dominant culture. And so it's not about throwing everything away. There are some aspects of dominant culture that are helpful or that are needed in certain situations, but we need to have more ways to access the success that we want to see. So the way that we're going to do this is through a little activity, and you all will have some time to do this alone as well in a moment. So first, I want us to think about putting on our white dominant culture lens. So if we are firmly thinking from that mindset and we think about success at work, what are some of the ways that we would define success in that white dominant frame lens? And you can just come off mute and share them, or you can put them in the chat.
So I would say counting things, and kind of the more things, the better.
Yep. Other folks?
I work in theater and we are constantly measured by the media and press feedback.
Yep, that's a great one. Other folks?
So in philanthropy, but also so written applications, but also the extent to which everything is communicated via email, and that you need a email confirmation for anything to be really happening. Thinking about that written word commitment.
Yep, that's a great one. Other folks?
I'd say power and privilege. And a lot of that might be even tied to amount of giving or donation that one brings to the organization.
Yep.
Sense of urgency in doing that, not including everyone in the discussion that really needs to be part of the discussion.
Yeah. Anybody else? All right, so we have a pretty good list here of some of the ways that we would define success if we really have on our lens of white dominant culture. So what we're going to do now is take off that hat and think about what are some of the things that we would measure, or how would we define success if we were not thinking through the lens of white dominant culture.
So I'm happy to do the flip side of what I said, which is that not everything that's important can be measured.
I would say truth and transparency, or integrity and transparency.
A sense of cohesiveness or kind of collective buy-in to what is decided.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say inclusive relationships, like that all relationships matter. Sorry, I'm a little wordy.
Okay.
culture of appreciation where all levels, all people are appreciated and valued.
One that I often hear people share is around salary and not having salary be considered only along titles. That's another one that I hear often. Are there any that we would want to take from the dominant culture side and add here? Are there any ones that we feel are important for us to still have on the shared value side?
Well, I'm happy to flip flop because actually counting of things helps you know how much you're doing, and helps the individual know how they're moving, especially if it's tied, that's way too many words, but tied to the mission. Right?
Yeah, I tried to get it all in there.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. All right, so let's look at this for a second. Sorry, it's not all neat and pretty, but what you can see is that when we think about multiple ways of measuring success, we get so much more of the picture of what's happening than when we only have that one lens. If we look at the things that are in the dominant culture circle, we have things about written communication, counting lots of things, being urgent, having a power around who gives the most, right? So even our relationships, we're building the stronger relationships based on how much someone else can do for us. Whereas when we look at the other example, we have inclusive relationships. All relationships matter. Appreciation of all levels. All people are appreciated. Sense of collectiveness and cohesiveness. If you look at the one on the right, there's just much more of a people-centered orientation. And that's what's able to happen if you are able to get away from there only being one right way or only one way to measure success at your organization. So I wanted you all to be able to have some time to work on more specific examples in small groups, but we are not going to be able to do groups. So instead, if there is something more specific that we want to work on as a group, I'm happy to sort of erase this and we can work together as a larger group since the breakout rooms aren't working right now. So yeah, if there is a topic or a specific thing, maybe you're thinking about manager relationships at your organization and you want to sort of deconstruct or unpack that more. Feel free to come off mute and share it or put it in the chat and we can just work on that together.
I'd love to throw out, so something that we're working on at my institution is trying to include more voices in power sharing and decision making, and thus we hope there's a ripple effect in maybe our younger, newer employees feeling and experiencing more value from the company. But we have found that it has become a difficult path to actually like finalizing a decision and a difficult path to maybe making some of those more expedient decisions where time does play a factor, especially how quickly things were changing after our theater closed down last year. And so I'm just wondering if anybody has some perhaps tactics of success to share with how you've included more voices, but perhaps have still created a final decision-making solution or a timeline solution for some of those more inclusive conversations now.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you want to unpack inclusive decision making with still having a defined timeline in there. Yeah, I think we can we can do that. So let me just share my screen again. And as I'm doing that, just start to think about, again, what are ways that we typically think about decision making when we have on our white dominant culture hat. So we'll do that first, and then we'll think about ways to unpack decision making in a more inclusive manner. So anybody can start specifically thinking through decision making. I think one of the things on this side is that seniority impacts who's making the decision or who has final say.
I would add to that also that bigger decisions get made by more senior people.
Mm-hmm. Other folks?
I think oftentimes in that dominant culture, there is not an explanation of the whys, why we did it.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of that, mom said because I said so.
Yep.
I think it's really easy to only focus on the quantitative inputs.
All right, this is a pretty good list. I'm just checking the time. I want to make sure I get you out on time as well. So when we think about more inclusive decision making, what are some of the elements that would need to be true?
Taking the time to get input and getting it at, all different levels across all different departments or job descriptions or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
Allowing people who are not the most senior to have final say on decisions.
I think a more inclusive and diverse senior leadership in itself, so that when that urgency is there, you've already built the inclusiveness from the jump, so you're always ready.
Mm-hmm.
We added something along the lines of you have to spend at least 5 minutes talking about why something new would work before you start talking about why it won't.
To Vanessa's point, I just put the SOAR analysis in there. Like whenever I would bring my team in on a decision, I structured it so that it wasn't aimless, and then also kind of helped them realize up front, like what is working. Like let's not just bash the system right now. What's going well? What do we want to change? And what are those opportunities we can tweak here? And usually it was productive and not super negative. So.
Yeah. So I'm going to make this a little bigger so that we can see some of the things that you all came up with. I think these are all great examples of how to make things more inclusive. And I think one of the things that we also have to be really thinking about when we are moving to a more multicultural frame is you often need more clarity than before, because dominant culture is just so natural in our society. You can often just, people make assumptions, right? Like the executive director or the leadership team is going to make the decision. There are certain assumptions that people make around decision making. And so when you're moving to a new frame, it's even more important to be really clear and say, hey, this decision, we need to make it within 3 weeks. If you're interested in being a part of the conversation or helping to shape the decision, here are the times when we're going to meet to discuss it. And here's going to be the follow-up. Ultimately, this group of 3 people are going to be the final decision makers, whether they're senior or not, right? But just being really clear and intentional about setting up that framing so that it does actually work. And so you're not in a situation where people are just having conversations for 6 months about something that you needed a decision on 2 weeks ago, because no one is clear on who's actually making the decision. So I think that's also something that can be helpful. And yeah, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I want to thank you all for joining me today. If you have any other questions or want to talk about this anymore, I'd be happy to do that. My contact information is in the app or in the brochure that you all have. And again, just thank you all for participating and for rolling with me when the breakout groups didn't happen. Something always happens with Zoom, so I appreciate it.